picking up the picture now in 1978, sir, Dr. Main was present at the Haemophilia Centre Directors meeting of the 13th of November 1978. I'm not going to put it up on screen because the minutes only tell us that Dr. Krask presented a hepatitis working party report, but we don't have the report itself. But we can see that hepatitis was still very much under active consideration and on the Haemophilia Centre Director's agenda. If we then turn to CBLA 301028, please. These are the minutes of the Haemophilia Centre Directors meeting in November of 1979. Now, there is no one physically in attendance from Belfast. Dr. Main sent her apologies, but again, you may wish to consider, sir, inferring that minutes would have been circulated and considered in due course. If we go in these minutes to page 18, we can see there the heading Hepatitis Working Party. We see Dr. Krask presenting his report. There's reference to some corrections being required to a table, and that any directors who wish to have the corrected version of the table should write to him. And then Dr. Krask said that the Working Party had drawn up a new form, Form C3, which they would like directors to complete for patients who had chronic hepatitis. The Working Party felt that it was important for the incidence of chronic hepatitis in haemophilic patients to be assessed. There was much discussion regarding the incidence of chronic hepatitis in haemophilic patients, the possible value of liver biopsies, and the type of information which directors would be willing to give to the Working Party. And then there's a discussion further down the page about attack rates. And then top of the next page, we can get up 4 lines down. It was agreed that the Working Party would produce a new 2-part form on which Haemophilia Centre directors could report cases of chronic hepatitis. So again, we see the question of the incidence, nature and extent of chronic hepatitis being one of the central issues under consideration by the Haemophilia Centre directors. If we then turn to HCDO 40406, this is the Reference Centre Director meeting, 22nd of September 1980. And if we go a little further down, we can see in paragraph 1, it says, Professor Bloom welcomed Dr. Elizabeth Main, who was attending a Reference Centre Directors meeting for the first time as Director for the Northern Ireland Haemophilia Reference Centre. So this is her first attendance as a Reference Centre Director. And if we then go to page 5, we can see that the Reference Centre Directors discuss reports from the Working Party Chairman, and they start with the Hepatitis Working Party. Dr. Krask presented tables outlining the results which the Working Party had obtained over the last year. And then there's a discussion about pool sizes, relative pool sizes at Elstree and Oxford, and he thought that was relevant. Plasma pools obtained from each batch of Elstree material was made from approximately 3,500 donors, whereas the Oxford material was made from plasma pools from approximately 500 donors. And Dr. Krask refers to a proposal to apply to the Department of Health for a grant to undertake a prospective study in Oxford regarding mildly affected patients and patients who were receiving concentrates. And then if we go a little further down, so we see the rest of the page, we can see 4 lines into the last paragraph, Dr. Krask said that there had been a poor response from directors to the request for information about patients thought to have developed chronic hepatitis, and he said that he proposed to ask the directors at the annual meeting in Glasgow to send in as soon as possible information about all patients who'd shown abnormal LFTs for 6 months or more. Dr. Krask said he was awaiting the results of the biopsy studies, which were currently being undertaken in Sheffield and at the Royal Free Hospital. This is obviously 2 years further on from the publication of Professor Preston's first set of biopsy studies in 1978. There were also further studies underway in Oxford, particularly with regard to patients who had received only Oxford factor VIII concentrate. Manchester setting up similar studies. Dr. Karanoff said that the biopsy studies in Sheffield and Royal Free were getting underway. About 40 patients studied so far. Professor Sherwood give a preliminary report on the findings at the Glasgow meeting. And of course, we know the Glasgow Symposium took place in September of 1980. We've looked at that with other witnesses. And then reference is made by, so Dr. Preston gave some details of the results found in Sheffield. Dr. Krask said in America it was found that approximately 5% of their donor population were carriers of non-A, non-B virus. No sensitive test to detect this virus was likely to be available for a year or two. There were therefore problems in interpreting the non-A, non-B hepatitis. The patients who were thought to have suffered from non-A, non-B hepatitis had very mild clinical symptoms. That's presumably in the acute stage, although it's not entirely clear. So that's the discussion at Dr. Main's first reference centre directors meeting in relation to hepatitis. And then if we just pick it up, last of all, in terms of the sequence of UK HCDO meetings in 1981, if we go to LOTH 5012_122, this is a meeting of the reference centre directors, September 1981. Dr. Main was present. If we go to page 7, under the heading Hepatitis Working Party, bottom of the page, we can see Dr. Krask presented the results of the Working Party's activities during the last few years. The cases of hepatitis reported by Haemophilia Centre directors have been mild in most instances, and no acute case in recent years had resulted in death. So that's dealing with acute cases. And then he goes on to consider chronic. Several questions were still to be answered regarding hepatitis in haemophiliacs. One was whether acute attacks of hepatitis in haemophiliacs would result in chronic liver problems in a few years' time. And then there's reference to the studies in relation to cryobuline and haemophil. And then over the page, not going to go through it in detail, but there's a discussion about the so-called reduced hepatitis or hepatitis-free products that then takes place and is recorded on that page. And then finally, for present purposes, CBLA 301466. This is a report for the Haemophilia Centre directors meeting on the 9th of October 1981. It's Dr. Krask's report. We go over the page. So it's a report of the Hepatitis Working Party, and if we just look by way of example, so there's reference to the studies in the first section under the heading Hepatitis Surveillance, and then under the heading Complications, a question of the significance of chronic hepatitis observed by several groups of workers in liver biopsies of patients with chronically elevated transaminases is still unanswered. Current investigations are attempting to relate the results in different groups of patients to their transfusion history, and there is strong evidence that different types of non-A, non-B hepatitis are related to different products. Most patients in this group are still entirely symptomless. The natural history of the disease in non-haemophiliacs is still not known, although there is some evidence to suggest that some patients with liver biopsy appearances of chronic active hepatitis have a better prognosis than patients with similar histology on liver biopsy whose liver disease is considered to be non-viral origin. There have been no further deaths directly or indirectly attributed to liver disease in the past year. And then there's a discussion of the incidence of hepatitis due to commercial versus NHS-associated hepatitis. So that's a bit of a whistle-stop tour through some of the materials and discussions being considered by the Hepatitis Working Party. In fact, there was one report I should also have gone to, which I omitted. It's a report from 1979 of the Hepatitis Working Party, HCDO 40135_023. So we'll see in the first paragraph, it refers to the Working Party having held 3 meetings during the year. Most of the business consisted of the organisation of projects related to the hepatitis surveillance programme and to the study of chronic liver disease in patients at the Oxford Haemophilia Centre. And if we go to page 7, if we go to page 5, under the heading mortality, no further fatalities directly due to acute hepatitis have been reported. 1 patient had acute non-A non-B hepatitis followed by persistent raised enzyme levels in 1978. He died of a retroperitoneal hemorrhage. Post-mortem was refused, but it's possible that his hepatitis indirectly contributed to his death. A further patient at Oxford who died of causes unrelated to liver disease was found on post-mortem to have portal cirrhosis, and it's recorded their hepatitis B antigen negative. We will be interested in any further cases where specimens of post-mortem liver can be obtained from haemophiliacs to collect further evidence of the prevalence of chronic liver disease. The preliminary results of the patients at Oxford so far studied for evidence of chronic liver disease are given in Appendix 1. 70 out of 174 patients had persistent transaminitis, but only, that's the word used, 20 of these so far have been found to have clinical evidence suggestive of chronic liver disease. If we omit the word only, we can see 20 out of 174 patients.
30%?
Yes, found to have clinical evidence suggestive of chronic liver disease. Again, there are more detailed discussions about various studies and non-A, non-B hepatitis in this document, which again was circulated for the purposes of I think the November 1979 meeting of Haemophilia Centre directors. We can see then the consideration being given at the Haemophilia Centre directors' annual meetings to issues relating to hepatitis. If we turn to material authored by Dr. Main herself, and we start with her HIV litigation report, that's CBLA 5072_024. And if we go to page 14, this is a section of Dr. Main's litigation report headed Hepatitis and or other viral infections. It's detailed and I won't go through all of it, but if we could pick it up at the bottom of this page. She says, transfusion-associated hepatitis was recognised with increasing frequency following the introduction of plasma and plasma-derived products for the treatment of haemophilia. And then I'll skip over the next sentence, which relates to a paragraph in the statement of claim. The haemophilia physicians of the United Kingdom addressed the problem constantly during the early years of treatment from 1967 onwards, and they continue to do so today. If we go to the next page, she then sets out certain thoughts as regards the risk of hepatitis from cryoprecipitate, and says, picking it up 4 lines down, previously the latter, that's cryoprecipitate, in paragraph 16b, again that's a reference to the statement of claim, is stated to have far smaller risks of viral transmission being prepared from single or small volume of donors. Relatively speaking, the statement is accurate, so she appears to be accepting it has far smaller risks of viral transmission, but then she observes it was the occurrence of cases of jaundice in just such treated patients that form part of the first UK survey of hepatitis. And then she provides further detail in relation to that. And then if we go over the page, we see she refers about 5 lines down in that first paragraph to work by Minucci in 1975 and Levine in 1977, describing a high prevalence of abnormal liver function tests amongst multi-transfused haemophiliacs, but the significance of their findings could not be determined at that time. The patients were clinically well. There's then a discussion about hepatitis B and the introduction of donor testing in the early 1970s. So if we then go on to the next page, please, and pick it up in the bottom half of the page. Dr. Main then refers to Dr. Krask's 1975 documentation of an outbreak of hepatitis in the United Kingdom. So that's the Bournemouth outbreak, I think, caused by 3 out of 4 batches of American origin commercial factor VIII concentrate, 4 cases of hepatitis B, 7 cases of short incubation or non-A, non-B hepatitis. 2 patients developed both forms of the disease. A total of 9 out of 18 patients became ill, a 50% attack rate. It was concluded that commercial concentrate should be reserved for the treatment of life-threatening bleeds or for covering major surgery. And so Dr. Main is here setting out these various reports. There's no suggestion in this document that Dr. Main is asserting that this is material that would be unfamiliar to haemophilia clinicians. She doesn't provide her own observation on the Krask recommendation of limiting commercial concentrate to major surgery or life-threatening bleeds. If we go over the page, the first main paragraph, she says the possible significance of asymptomatic hepatitis became apparent by 1978 when structural abnormalities of the liver were described in patients. And the reference there, footnote 27, is to an article in the New England Journal of Medicine in 1978 by Spiro, Lewis and others, called Asymptomatic Structural Liver Disease and Haemophilia. She says there was histological evidence of chronic active hepatitis and cirrhosis. The findings were thought to be related to the multi-transfused nature of the patients, and also the possible effects of the persistence of virus within the liver cells, etc. And then she refers to similar histological abnormalities being described in haemophiliacs with evidence of non-A, non-B hepatitis by Aladort, 1985, and Hay, 1985. And she refers to Dr. Preston's work in 1988. I'm just going to check that that's right. Yes. So that is an article published in 1988. But of course, we have also Dr. Preston's 1978 work. And then she says in the bottom half of that page, the exposure risk for non-A, non-B hepatitis was difficult to determine, as prior to 1989 there was no marker test available for its detection. The diagnosis was established on exclusion of other infection and by abnormalities of liver function tests. So she appears there to be suggesting that you could still make a diagnosis of non-A, non-B hepatitis by reference to excluding other causes and looking at liver function test results. And then she refers to, in 1984, a finding about non-A, non-B hepatitis, and says it was difficult to ascertain the true risk of infection from non-A, non-B hepatitis. And then if we go over the next page, she says in the second line, it would seem that haemophiliacs in the UK being exposed to both home-produced and commercial factor VIII would have a high infection rate. This has been found to be the case, and then she refers to the Fletcher paper in 1983. There's then a discussion about, in the bottom half of this page, about the incidence of hepatitis B infection decreasing. And then halfway through that paragraph, she says, the awareness of the long-term risks of non-A, non-B infection evolved gradually. It's evident that all products were implicated to some degree, regardless of plasma source. Over the page, she then says this: at all times, the risk-benefit ratio of treatment versus non-treatment, so that's the choice that's posited as opposed to treatment with concentrates versus treatment with cryoprecipitate, or lots of treatment versus modest amounts of treatment, or any other alternatives, had to be applied to patient care. And then this, the patients themselves became aware of the risks of hepatitis during the mid-1970s. Now, the evidence she puts forward to that is the World in Action documentary. In particular, after the 1975 outbreak in the UK, a World in Action television programme dealt with the problem in detail. During the course of the screening, one patient was asked if he'd been put off using his factor VIII concentrate. He replied that he'd used it again immediately he developed a painful bleed into an elbow joint. And then she asserts this: the majority of patients were of the same opinion. Freedom from pain was of paramount importance to them. Krask recommended a return to the use of cryoprecipitate for routine treatment. That's his 1975 Lancet article. But by that time, a majority of patients were well established in self-injection programs. Unfortunately, it was impractical for home treatment. It was practical for the treatment of patients not previously treated, as they were at special risk of hepatitis, also for mildly affected patients, children and those suffering from von Willebrand syndrome, a policy adopted by many and recommended by the UK Haemophilia directors. And then she makes reference to some matters which I don't think make particular sense unless we compare them against the statement of claim in the HIV litigation. So you'll see there assertions that the majority of patients were of the opinion that they weren't put off using concentrates. The evidence from that, well, no evidence is given other than a reference to one patient in the World in Action programme. You will know, sir, from the evidence you've heard and read from patients and their families, that the thrust of that evidence is that patients were not routinely informed of hepatitis risks posed by blood products prior to their use. And if that's right, weren't then given the ability to make an informed choice. And obviously those are matters of fact that you'll have to consider and resolve. There's one further document authored by Dr. Main before I look at what she says in her statements to the inquiry. It's at WITN 0736011. It's not dated, but it is, we understand, authored by Dr. Main. She says under the heading Historical, the occurrence of jaundice after introduction of human plasma into the body was first noted well over 100 years ago in German shipyard workers vaccinated with a human lymph-derived vaccine, and later further described during the Second World War in British soldiers inoculated using multi-shared syringes. In 1943, Beeson reviewed this information and described other patients suffering what was then called homologous serum jaundice. This condition was further reviewed by Sperling et al. In 1964, who recognised the increased risk of pooling blood plasma for infusions into patients. There's then a short discussion of hepatitis A. Then we see hepatitis B. She says this form of hepatitis is the one described as homologous serum jaundice by Besson. It has a long incubation period of up to 6 months and is termed hepatitis B. And then there's reference to the discovery of the Australia antigen and the introduction of tests. And we can see in the last sentence on that page, in the early 1970s, it was appreciated that the prevalence of hepatitis B was increased both in drug addicts and in prison inmates. And then if we go over the page, we can see the heading non-A, non-B hepatitis, and it says this: in 1974, Prince et al. First noted a large proportion of post-transfusion hepatitis patients did not have any evidence of the B hepatitis virus. They postulated that there could be other transfusion-transmitted hepatitis viruses type C, In 1974, Alter and colleagues confirmed these findings, and from then on the term non-A, non-B hepatitis was used. And of course, these are...
Just a question there on the basic facts of that. In the Nobel Prize citation, Alter was one of the laureates, was he not?
I can't remember, I'm afraid. I'm ashamed to say, sir.
Well, I have a feeling that the citation talks about 1972 as being the first bit of research, but that can be checked.
That can be checked, yes. The Prince and Alter reports are part of the material that we've looked at on a number of occasions. And of course, they contain expressions of view as to the potential serious nature of, or chronic nature of non-A, non-B hepatitis. This article or report continues, there appear to be several types of non-A, non-B hepatitis, the type which has a short incubation period and some which have a longer incubation period. The clinical picture of non-A, non-B hepatitis compared to hepatitis B tends to be mild. Very infrequently, the infection is totally...
Very frequently?
Yes, sorry, very frequently the infection is totally symptomless and may only be detected by blood tests of liver function. The most usual test is of a substance known as transaminase. A persistently raised transaminase known as ALT used to be presumptive evidence of hepatitis in multi-transfused patients. And then she says this, the risk that non-A, non-B hepatitis could progress to chronic hepatitis was known in 1977, but the full significance, and perhaps the word full in itself is of significance, of its effects was not appreciated, elaborated and investigated until the mid to late 1980s. And then she deals with the isolation of hepatitis C itself and its naming of such, and the development of tests. We can, I think, skip over what's said about hepatitis D. If we go to the next page, it says transfusion-associated hepatitis was recognised with increasing frequency following the use of FFP and plasma-derived concentrates produced for the treatment of all types of haemophilia. The haemophilia physicians of the UK constantly addressed the problem from 1967 onwards, culminating in the establishment of the United Kingdom Haemophilia Directors Hepatitis Working Party. It was instituted in 1977 under the chairmanship of the virologist Dr. John Krask. She then talks in the next paragraph in the early 70s about hepatitis B infection giving rise to the greatest concern. And then if we go into the next paragraph, we can see picking up in the third line, there's reference to the Minucci's work in 1975. And then if we go to the next paragraph, reference to the 1979 Hepatitis Working Party report. So these are some of the, in terms of the UK HCGO, some of the materials that I've just shown you, sir. And it would appear to confirm that this was material known to and available to Dr. Main at the time. So she refers to the report of 1979 with an increase in the proportion of non-A, non-B hepatitis reported in patients with mild coagulation defects receiving concentrate for the first time. And then she refers to the Hepatitis Working Party's report for 82-83. And then if we go over the page, she quotes from a paragraph entitled Prospective Studies of Hepatitis in Infrequently Treated Haemophiliacs. I won't read out the quote, but if we go to the paragraph beginning, the report confirmed that patients remained at risk from developing non-A, non-B and from hepatitis B infection, the latter despite donor selection, and the patients were being infected regardless of the source of their replacement treatment. There's then a discussion about hepatitis B vaccination, and then she goes on to consider the impact of the AIDS epidemic, and I'll be coming to look at AIDS tomorrow. But if we go to the next page, the final paragraph, she says this about Northern Ireland. It was estimated in the Northern Ireland Haemophilia Centre that 112 patients had been exposed to the possibility of virus infections following receipt of replacement treatment. She then gives the number in relation to those who developed HIV, 16, which I'll come back to tomorrow. 76 of the 112 developed hepatitis, an incidence of 72%. In some centres in the United Kingdom, the incidence was as high as 95%. The rationale for these figures being slightly better than in other centres in the UK was because it was a policy within the centre that patients, as far as possible and practicable, should receive only product from one source. And then she gives here her rationale for that. This was because it had become realised that using concentrate prepared from many different large pools of plasma were likely to be more effective. The rationale was sound, but the results were only partially effective. So it's said there, it would appear, that the underlying treatment policy in relation to trying to use one source of product was on safety grounds in terms of risks of viral transmission. And obviously it'll be a matter for you, sir, to consider all the material and consider whether you accept that was the reason. I want to come finally then in relation to knowledge of risk of hepatitis. We'll look in more detail tomorrow at some of the information that was then given and the way in which testing was undertaken and so on. But on knowledge of risk, to what Dr. Main says in her witness statements. So if we can start with WITN 0736007. This is a statement made in response to made by Dr. Main in response to the evidence of patients or relatives who've given evidence to the inquiry. If we just look at a couple of passages, bottom of this page, Dr. Main says this in paragraph 2, during the 1970s, during the 1970s, both, that's the two patients she's talking about, were commenced on home treatment. In accordance with the centre's practice, at review appointments, bloods were taken to test for anemia and the presence of an inhibitor. Liver function tests were also performed because of my apprehension about the adverse effect of prolonged IV treatment. So she says there in terms the reason for undertaking liver function tests from the 1970s onwards was because of concerns about adverse effects of treatment. And then in this statement, if we go to the last page, picking it up in paragraph 13, second line, she says, I had observed these abnormal liver function tests for so long without there being any apparent clinical ill effects that I think I could have been lulled into a false sense of security. I'm not at all sure. That would appear to suggest in any event that Dr. Main was observing over a prolonged period of time in her patients' abnormal liver function test results.
Now, this is talking about 1995.
It is, but I don't. I think she's probably making a more general observation. But yes, absolutely. She is there suggesting that in 1995, the significance of hepatitis C, as it was then known and had been known for several years, was not fully appreciated by her.
Well, she's responding to a comment that she didn't spell out some of the serious consequences to the witness, and she's saying, I didn't do that because I didn't realise there were any.
Yes.
I mean, I'm
paraphrasing, but yes.
Paraphrasing.
Yes. And I'll deal with the question of what information was and wasn't given to patients in a little more detail tomorrow. But you're absolutely right, sir. That is in effect what's being said here. But we also see apparent observation of abnormal liver function tests over prolonged periods of time. And then if we go to WITN 0736001, This again is a statement in response to criticisms by or evidence given by former patients. And if we go please to page 11, and we look at paragraph 5.2, and this is looking at an earlier period, 1976, and she says in the second sentence, at that time, treatment was considered to be both effective and safe. Again, the consistency of that statement with everything else that we've looked at about hepatitis risks, it will be a matter for you to consider, sir. There were a few facts available.
Well, that was the same time as she was saying that those people who had watched the programme in 1975, drawing the risks, they knew all about the risks.
Yes, and were then taking an informed decision to carry on with their treatment. Yes, that is what she said in the report that we looked at.
So, yes. Somehow I have to reconcile those two rather different views.
Yes, that is a task for you, sir. And then we see in the third line there are few facts available regarding viral infections at this time, apart from the historical and rare transmission of hepatitis B. Then she refers to abnormal liver function tests being under constant consideration by the Hepatitis Working Party. Hepatitis C, not a recognised entity at this time, well, that as a matter of fact is obviously correct. And then this risks of viral infection were discussed at the hospital clinic and at the annual patient meetings held in Craigavon Area Hospital each November. And those meetings, I think, are referenced by Dr. Main in one of her other statements as well. Again, the evidence you've heard from individuals has been to the effect, in the vast majority of cases, that information about risks of non-A, non-B hepatitis was not shared with them, and so that will be an issue that you'll need to consider. And then just dealing still with this...
Well, I don't quite see how the risks of viral infection could exist for the purposes of discussing it at the hospital clinic and at the annual patient meetings in Craigavon each November, with the facts that in 1976 it was thought safe. And unless she's describing a very different period of time.
Yes. Yes, on the one hand, it's safe, few facts available. On the other, risks were discussed with patients. There is undoubtedly a tension between those two. If we go 2 pages further on in this statement, paragraph 6.2, Dr. Main says this, picking it up towards the end of the first line, up until the hepatitis C virus was identified in 1991, no one really knew what to expect. Gradually, information evolved, different subtypes were identified, clinical symptoms of fatigue were more marked in some than others. Always, I had an ominous feeling about the virus. And then she refers to a haemophilia weekend arranged in 1995. Again, maybe a tension between saying as late as 1991 no one really knew what to expect, and at the same time the broader point made in the HIV litigation report that the risks were well known to patients. And then finally for today, I think, or at least in terms of the witness statements, WITN 0736009 if we go to page 20, bottom half of the page, Dr. Main says this in paragraph 22.1, the possible transmission of viral hepatitis through blood transfusion, plasma infusion, or the infusion of plasma-derived products has been well known for a long time. I first learned of it as an undergraduate in the 1950s. And then there's a reference to what was required for the MRC path in haematology and the requirement to spend time within the blood transfusion service. And she says, during this time, in my case, the topic of transmission-induced infection was dealt with in detail. And then she refers also to there being postgraduate courses and informal discussions with NIBTS and virologist colleagues. If we go further down the page, between the late 1970s and the mid-1980s, there was increasing evidence that non-A, non-B hepatitis was not as benign as had been thought, but could progress from chronic persistent hepatitis to cirrhosis. It is important to stress that it was an evolving picture. And then if we go a little further down the page to paragraph 24.1, she says, I was aware that there was a higher prevalence of non-A, non-B infection associated with commercial concentrate compared to NHS concentrate, but the latter also presented a significant risk of viral infection. An important factor in transmission is the potential size of the donor population in each category. And then over the page, she says in paragraph 26.1, by 1972, my knowledge of the viral transmission of hepatitis B and non-A, non-B hepatitis was incomplete, as it was with all my colleagues. Hepatitis B transmission remained a constant risk. Thankfully, in reality, in the haemophiliacs in Northern Ireland, it was almost non-existent. To the best of my recollection, only 2 subclinical cases were ever detected in centre patients. However, it was necessary to maintain vigilant testing. And then she refers to an article in the Ulster Medical Journal, which I'll go to in a moment, and says that conflicts with her recollection. And then in 26.4, she says, in respect of non-A, non-B, the situation remained perplexing for almost 20 years. This was evidenced by the persistence of abnormal liver function in treated patients. Although one knew there was ongoing virological research on a worldwide basis, the lack of identification of a causative agent was a constant worry. Not all colleagues expressed an equal degree of concern. It was suggested that I stop testing if it was so upsetting. I took the opposite view and continued. And then she says in the next paragraph, gradually knowledge progressed, liver histology was identified, and in 1991 hepatitis C was identified. It has proved to be a complex and deadly virus, possibly in keeping with its long prodromal phase. Top of the net.
Just focusing on those last few words, starting possibly. This is a suggestion that where an infection has a very long period before symptoms are manifested, they're all the worse because of it.
Yes.
Yes.
Just top of the next page. The report that we looked at a few minutes ago about hepatitis, you'll see what it is in paragraph 26.6, an extract from a medico-legal report that Dr. Main wrote in 2000 or 2001. So that's the document that we looked at a moment ago.
That was the report for the HIV litigation, wasn't it?
No, there's the long report in italics, in italic text, which is the HIV litigation report. But we looked a few minutes ago also at WITN 0736011.
Ah, yes. That's the one where you say it was undated.
Yes. So that's that document.
That's that one. That's
been produced to the inquiry by Dr. Main, and she tells us in her witness statement it's an extract from a medico-legal report she wrote in 2000-2001. So it confirms the authorship and gives us data about or information about when it was produced. There are then just, I think, before finishing today, two further documents on the issue of hepatitis. The first is the Ulster Medical Journal article on hepatitis B incidents that she refers to in her witness statement, WITN 3082021. It's an article headed Hepatitis B virus infection in Northern Ireland 1970 to 1987. And I can pick it up in the summary. In the 18 years between 1970 and 1987, 504 patients were found to have hepatitis B surface antigen in their blood. Acute hepatitis was present in 184 patients and 6 died. The annual incidence of acute hepatitis B virus infection in Northern Ireland was about 1/4 that of England and Wales. And then if we go to the bottom of the page, we can see under the heading Patients, Materials and Methods that testing for hepatitis B surface antigen began in the regional virus laboratory in 1970 in blood donors required for the renal unit Belfast City Hospital, and further information is then given about the testing process. If we go to the third page, we can see a table with categories of patients infected with hepatitis B virus. The second category is haemophiliacs, and we can see there 11 that's the number with acute hepatitis, deaths in brackets, so one fatality. And then there's also 8 who'd received multiple transfusions. That would be non-haemophiliac transfusions. And then if we go to the next page, halfway down, there's a heading Blood and Blood Products Transmission, and we see the information relating to haemophiliacs. Acute infections occurred in 11 patients between 1972 and 1982 after receiving blood transfusions, cryoprecipitate or factor VIII, and 1 patient died aged 51 years. And then there's reference to multiple transfusions. Acute infections took place between 1970 and 80 in 8 patients who'd received multiple transfusions after surgery. So I think that's all one needs to look at in that article. And then finally, WITN 0198002, please. This is a letter from Dr. Main in March 1984. If we look at the text of the letter, it provides information about a mildly affected haemophiliac, and we can see in the second paragraph Dr. Main saying this: a mild haemophilic of this type should be treated with cryoprecipitate or NHS factor VIII and not commercial freeze-dried factor VIII concentrates. This precaution is to avoid the development of non-A, non-B hepatitis in mildly affected patients. So a clear understanding of the risk of non-A, non-B being articulated in this letter in 1984. So those are the documents that throw some light on knowledge of risk of hepatitis amongst Belfast clinicians in general and Dr. Main in particular. Tomorrow I'm going to undertake a similar exercise in relation to knowledge of risk of HIV, and then turn to consider the process of testing patients for HIV and then for hepatitis C, and patients being informed of their diagnosis, so the procedure that was adopted and the adequacy or inadequacy of the information provided to them.
Yes. Well, thank you very much. Until 10 o'clock. 10 o'clock tomorrow.